For today's video, I'm going to be walking you through how I set up this unheated Celestial Pearl Nano Aquarium. Right from the beginning, I aim to keep this one as simple and budget friendly as possible while also keeping it small and compact to save as much space as I could. Unfortunately, I lost all of the original setup footage due to a hard drive crash, so I'll be showing you the tank in its current state while explaining everything that's going on in here. So let's start by going over the actual aquarium that I've used for this setup, and this is a 24 litre Aqua Town tank which is just over 6 US gallons, and I picked it up at Pets at Home. I was interested in trying this out because it came with a lid, but as you can see I'm no longer using it as it blocked too much light and started to affect my plants. The tank also came with an included filter, but I decided to ditch it because it had a tiny amount of filter media inside of it as well. I did worry that the tank's rim might interfere with installing a hang-on back filter, but as you can see it fits perfectly, and the original lid slots also allowed me to use the hob in this position without issue. But if I could rewind time, I'd probably opt for a 25 litre Diversa tank off Amazon because they are slightly cheaper, slightly larger, and in my experience with the other 6 that I own, it has a better build quality. Now this current setup is a little on the small side for an active fish like Celestial Pearl Danios, so I am thinking of upgrading them to a larger tank soon. Possibly a 45 litre which is around 12 US gallons, or maybe a 54 litre which is around 14, but more on that later. So moving on to the equipment that I used for this tank, and I wanted to keep everything as budget friendly and beginner friendly as possible. As I mentioned earlier, this is a room temperature unheated aquarium, so there's no need for any type of aquarium heating unit. This helps to keep costs down because I'm not paying for a heating unit or the electricity required to run it, so it really is a budget friendly tank when you're using a modern LED light because they are cheap to run. My fish room maintains an average temperature of around 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit in winter, and everything in this tank thrives at this water temperature. I'm using the Seaoura SR616 light on this tank, and I really like this lighting unit. I've got it on a bunch of my other tanks and I highly recommend it for this type of setup. If you stick to a tank size similar to this one, the smallest, cheapest SR616 light will do the job and support the growth of a lot of popular plants in the hobby. The control unit on the light is easy to operate, and I run mine at maximum intensity for 6 hours per day, and I don't have any algae issues, as you'll see in the video footage as we work through the video. On top of that, you set the intensity you want and then press the timer at the time you want the lights to come on each day, and then after that you leave it and the built-in timer chip will take over, removing the need for you to touch the light every day to turn it on and off. Next is the Nicrew Slim filter, which has kept the tank's water parameters safe and stable since the cycle completed. This really is a great little filter when set up and maintained properly, but there's a frequently returned notice on Amazon for it. The most common complaint for this filter is that it works fine for a few weeks or months before it starts to leak. Now there could be some faulty units out there, but I have a lot of these in my fish room now, and I honestly suspect that the issue is due to improper maintenance with the included cartridge media. As you can see with these cartridges, once this filter floss blocks, the water flow is restricted, but the pump in the filter still pushes water at its normal rate, creating the unit to overflow. Unfortunately, it doesn't have an overflow spillway like this All Punch Solutions hang-on back filter that's for slightly larger tanks that will return excess water to the aquarium if the media gets blocked. So with the Nicrew filter, once the filter floss in this cartridge gets blocked, there's nowhere else for the water to go but up and up and up until it overflows and starts leaking. Thankfully there's 2 easy fixes to avoid this, with the first one being to replace your cartridges as soon as they get clogged, but that gets expensive. So the second way you can avoid the problem is to set your filter up the same way as me. I replace the included cartridge with some custom cut 30 ppi foam and then use some separate filter floss for mechanical filtration, and I trim them down to size using the cartridge that comes included with the filter. This only ends up costing around the same as a 6-month supply of the filter cartridges, but it lasts you so much longer. On top of that, it also drastically increases the amount of surface area available for beneficial bacteria and archaic colonies to colonize to maintain safe and stable water parameters in your tank. Setting the filter up in this way also lets me change the filter floss as required without needing to replace my biological media and risking a spike in ammonia or nitrite levels. If you're considering a similar setup to this one in a cooler room temperature than mine, you might want to include a heater in the setup to keep everything operational. I recommend a Hygge Nano filter as it's compact, easy to use, and it's been reliable in my experience, and I currently use one in my Wohlstad Method guppy tank, my Wohlstad Method Endler guppy tank, and a quarantine tank, and I never have issues with them. However, these also have a frequently returned notice on Amazon, and this is probably due to the product's inaccurate minimum tank size claims. For example, there's no way you're going to be running a 75 watt heater on a 0.5 US gallon tank. It's just not going to happen, and some people have tried using the 50 watt version of this heater in a small 6 gallon tank similar to this one, which is around 23 litres, and it's just too powerful. Now, I have fed this back to Hygge today, so hopefully they will tweak this and make it easier to understand which heater model you need for your specific tank size. Personally, I just follow the very popular tried and tested guideline of using 1 watt of heater power per litre of water in your tank, which has always worked out for me. So for this specific tank, I'd be going with the 25 watt model. So moving on to Substrate and Hardscape, and I chose Fluval Stratum as the substrate of choice for this particular tank because it's always performed well in my other aquariums, and I wanted to do some specific stuff with the Hardscape. Since this tank is quite small, the 2 kilogram or 4.4 pound bag may have been enough to get the job done, but I did choose to go with the 4 kilo or 8.8 pound bag of Fluval Stratum, and I ended up with about 25% of it left over. My main goal was to have at least 1 inch of substrate in the bottom of the tank, making it easier to plant while also allowing me to partially bury some of the hardscape, but this is not essential. It's more of an aquascaping technique for certain dragonstone aquascapes that I want to try in the future, and this was kind of a dry run at that. For the rocks, I went with Sirius stone as my tap water is soft, and Sirius stone gradually releases calcium carbonate into the water, which increases pH and hardness. This benefits my shrimp when they molt, as well as the health of my snail's shell, while also bringing the tank's water parameters closer to those found in the natural habitats of the celestial pearl Danios, where their collection point has a pH of just over 7. I decided to use spiderwood for driftwood, and I know that I use this a lot in my tanks, but I love the way it looks and it doesn't release as many tannins into the tank as other types of wood, so it avoids that kind of browny yellow tint some types of driftwood can provide. As you can see in the video, this piece of driftwood offers plenty of hiding spots for my fish if something scares them, while also offering hiding spots for newly molted shrimp until their carapace hardens. So moving on, and we get to cycling the tank, and I use the dark start method for this setup, which I've explained in a dedicated video, and I'll link to that in the description if you want to check it out. But in short, at this point of the tank build, I had the substrate and hardscape in the tank, as well as the filter set up and running. I did have the light resting on the aquarium, but if you are using the dark start method, you shouldn't turn your light on because there's going to be a lot of excess nutrients in the water during the cycling process, and if you have your light on, it can generate a lot of algae. Then I dosed the tank with Dr. Tim's ammonia solution to simulate a bioload to feed the microorganism colonies that I needed to grow, and I just followed the easy to understand instructions on the bottle. At this point it was just a waiting game, and I had to wait to let nature take its course. The goal here is to establish beneficial microorganism colonies to handle the aquarium's waste load, keeping water parameters safe and stable for my fish, shrimp, snails and plants. When fish produce waste or they have leftover food in the tank or plant leaves start to decay, ammonia is released into the water column, which can harm your livestock. Beneficial archaea and bacteria colonies convert the ammonia into nitrite, which is also toxic, and then a different type of bacteria converts the nitrite into nitrate, which is far less harmful to your fish. Thankfully, nitrate is very easy to manage, and live plants can do do a lot of the heavy lifting with it because it serves as a nutrient for the plants to assist with growth, but depending on the plants you choose, you may need to assist them with some partial water changes. After around a month of cycling, the tank could process a 2 ppm dose of the Dr. Tim's ammonia solution down to 0 ppm ammonia and 0 ppm nitrite within 24 hours, so I considered the cycle to be complete. So with the tank being able to handle the expected bioload at this stage, I started to plant and stock the aquarium. Rather than sticking to plants that I already had experience with, I did decide to do a few experiments with some new types of plants that I've never tried before, just to see how they'd perform. The first new plant that I tried was Ludwigia palustrius green, which did survive the winter and it did grow a little bit, but it came in leggy, meaning there's very few leaves coming in at the lower stems, which is usually a lighting issue to be fair, but Ludwigia does seem to have this issue consistently. I eventually replaced the Ludwigia with Rotala Rotundifolia a few days before recording this, and that's why it looks a little rough still, but the Rotala is tried and tested in multiple tanks in both the summer and winter months in my setups, and it just performs well. Another plant that I was new to was Windelov Fern, and this is a variety of Java fern with naturally split leaf tips, giving it a unique look. While it did well at first for say 3 to 4 months, as soon as the winter months kicked in, temperature did take its toll and most of it melted away unfortunately. I do still have one rhizome left and I've moved it to the right hand side of the hardscape just to leave it there and see what happens, and it does have some new healthy growth coming through, but I am curious what happens during the summer months. Another plant that I was brand new to is Dwarf Sagittaria, which I planted in this tank as well as my 12-gallon White Cloud Mountain minnow setup. It's thrived in both tanks, but it has grown taller under the low-powered Seaoura light, sending out runners and grown consistently throughout the winter cold months. My White Cloud tank has a more powerful moderate intensity light, but as you can see in the video clip, the Dwarf Sagittaria hasn't grown as tall as it has under the low-powered light, and a quick bit of research that I did suggests that this is normal for this plant. For the foreground of the tank, I tried another new plant, and it was Marsilea Hirsuta. Now this one has grown slowly over the winter, and I mean very slow, but it hasn't melted or had any issues, and now that we're in the spring and temperatures are slowly increasing, I have noticed an increased growth rate with it. With any luck, as we work through the spring and summer months, it will spread out and form a more thick carpet in the foreground of the tank. I did have an Anubias Nano Mini at the base of the driftwood, but I can't remember if I moved it to a different tank or gave it to a friend for his aquarium. Since then, I've added 3 Anubias Petite plants to the driftwood just to add a pop of colour and keep things interesting. I also recently added a Bucephalandra Kedagang a few days before recording the video, and that's why it looks a bit drunk and it's grown in the wrong direction, because it had to be flipped compared to the tank I had it in before, but over time it will grow towards the light and start going up. I also added duckweed and water lettuce on the surface of the tank to help assist with stabilising water parameters, as well as making the fish feel safer by blocking out some of the light and adding some surface cover. I will leave a complete list of the tank's current plants in the description if you want the exact spellings of their names to find them for your own tanks. But everything in here with its current setup has the proven ability to survive in my fish room without a heater in the tank, so I am looking forward to seeing what happens next winter when the temperatures start to drop again. So by this point the tank was cycled and planted, and it was time to add some livestock. I started by adding a couple of pink ram's horn snails because these are documented as living in slightly higher ammonia levels because of the swamps in Florida, so they are hardier than the fish and shrimp that I was going to add to the tank. Adding the ram's horn snails to the tank first just lets me feed them and see if there's an ammonia spike without putting any fish or snails at risk, and if there is an ammonia spike, it's not much of an issue for this specific species of snail. As you can see in the video footage, there are an absolute ton of tiny little baby ram's horn snails in here, so the handful of adults that I added back at the start of winter have been very busy over the last couple of months, and there's also a couple of egg clutches on the tank glass, so there's going to be even more babies soon. After around a week of feeding the ram's horn snails in the tank and checking the water parameters and not having any issues, I decided to move some of the red cherry shrimp over from my main breeding tank. Beside adding a pop of colour, Neocaridina shrimp are underrated for soft algae control, and they're also great for cleaning up leftover food, helping to maintain safe and stable water parameters. Although I didn't notice any pregnant females over the winter months, with us being into the spring months now, I did spot this one about a week ago, and as you can see, she's carrying plenty of eggs, so we're going to have some baby shrimp in here soon. Some people say that celestial pearl Danios will eat baby shrimp, while I've seen other people disagree and say they're fine, but I'm gonna find out within a couple of weeks either way. Now, I could have added my celestial pearl Danios at that stage of the build, but they are a little difficult to find in my area, so it took maybe 2 to 3 more weeks. But I noticed that Gateshead Guppies, one of my local aquatic stores, put a post on their Facebook page saying they had CPDs up for sale, so I went through to buy some. When I got there, they had a deal on, so I paid for 10 because it wasn't that much more expensive than getting the 8 that I planned, but he must have accidentally netted up an extra one and I ended up with 11 CPDs. Because of the relatively small size of the tank, I was a little bit worried about this, but thankfully I haven't had any issues with ammonia or nitrite spikes in the tank, and the fish seem to have settled in nicely, established their breeding hierarchy and just gone about their business. The CPDs were very skittish when I first added them to the tank, and they would instantly dart behind the spiderwood and plant cover whenever I approached, but since then they have come to associate me with being the thing that adds food to their tank, so now they basically ignore me and it's a lot easier for me to watch them swim around. Celestial pearl Danios look fantastic, and their activity levels are slowly increasing as the spring months kick in and things get warmer, which means we might see some breeding soon. If I'm lucky, I might get some fry, and I'm ready with some fry food ready to go since I'm already using it to feed some baby white cloud mountain minnows in another tank. And that brings me on to feeding, because one of the biggest challenges with nano fish like CPDs is actually feeding them because their mouths are so small. Fortunately, nano tanks and nano fish keeping is becoming a lot more popular, so a lot more brands are catering to its needs, so it is becoming easier to find suitable foods for these tiny little fish. I feed my celestial pearl Danios NT Labs Micro Crumb as it's the perfect size for their tiny mouths and they go crazy for it. I know that it can be difficult to find outside of Europe, but if you're over in North America, then the Aquarium Corp Magic Small Fish Feed looks to be a similar size, so I'd give that a try. If you are struggling to find any micro size fish food, then you can use the pepper grinder trick too. You basically get a pepper grinder, put some fish food granules or flakes in it, and then you'll adjust the cap on there to the desired grain size, and then you basically grind it into the tank to get some tiny little particles of food in there. If you do try something like this and your specific setup only has celestial pearl Danios and shrimp in it, then you can try adding entire granules of something like bug bites to the tank, and once it sinks and the water makes it soft, the fish will pick at it and eat it. However, in my tank, the snails generally swarm around any solid food that gets put in there, blocking the fish from getting access to it, so that's not a realistic option for my setup, unfortunately. Portion control is also very important, especially during the winter months if you're keeping your tank without a heater, because the metabolism of your fish, shrimp, snails, plants and microorganisms all slow down during the cooler water temperatures. Over the winter, I've been adding this much food to the tank once per day, and everything in here is done fine, and as you can see in the video footage, there's been plenty of food left over for the little baby snails to feed. Now that the spring is here, I am monitoring and adjusting my feeding levels for my unheated tanks by just seeing how much food the fish eat and how quickly that they eat it, and I'll increase the food levels if needed. I'd like to quickly go over the aquarium's maintenance needs too, but you have to keep in mind the majority of my experience with this tank has been during the colder winter months and everything slows down when it's cold, and it's basically the aquarium's lowest upkeep stage. So far, the only real task that I've had is removing the excess duckweed from the tank once per week using a cheap hair comb to easily skim it off the surface. The tank hasn't needed any regular partial water changes either because I haven't been adding that much food, and the duckweed has easily been able to manage the nitrate and TDS build-up, keeping the tank stable. Right now I'm replacing the small filter floss cutout that I use for mechanical filtration monthly, and when I do that I also give the 30 ppi foam that I'm using for biological filtration a quick squeeze out just to keep things clean. The lighting unit on the tank just uses the built-in timer function, so it's completely hands off after the first couple of minutes to set it up, and the Neocaridina and ram's horn snails in here help keep algae under control. As the weather warms up, I'm anticipating trimming the Rotala Rotundifolia about once a month, just like in my other tanks, and I'm probably going to have to remove the extra Dwarf Sagittaria runners when necessary. Some people may choose to remove decaying plant leaves from their aquarium setups, which may increase the maintenance requirements a little bit, but personally I just let decaying leaves break down naturally and become part of the ecosystem as they serve as food for shrimp, snails, microorganisms and plants. Beyond that, it's been a very straightforward and easy to maintain tank, and I do consider this to be very beginner friendly. Now I want to finish the video by addressing the future of this tank, because as much as I like it and enjoy watching it, I do feel that the Celestial Pearl Danios in here would be happier in a larger setup. So I can't decide right now if I want to keep the CPDs in here or transfer them to a bigger tank and rescape this one, or move the CPDs over to a bigger tank, keep this one as it is but restock it with a different type of fish. I'm nearly finished rearranging my fish room for better space utilization, and within the next month or two I'll have a better picture of how many larger tanks I can actually keep in here, and then I'll be able to make a more informed decision. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. Thanks for watching, I hope it's been helpful, and good luck with your aquariums moving forward.